"She doesn't belong here. Get her out." 12 SEAL operators heard Commander Vaughn say it. 12 men watched the woman at the door, no weapon, no uniform, no rank insignia, and waited for her to step back. She stepped forward instead. She placed both hands flat on the briefing table, looked Vaughn directly in the eyes and said, "3 of your men got hurt on March 4th because someone in this room told the enemy exactly where they would be. I know who, I know how, and I know why you haven't found him yet." She paused. "Because you've been too busy watching the wrong person." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. If this story stopped you cold, stay until the very end. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The briefing room at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek had seen harder things than silence. It had absorbed the weight of grief after missions that went wrong, carried the tension of commanders making impossible calls at 2 in the morning with bad intelligence and worse odds. The men inside it, 12 of them all. SEAL operators from Team 7 had bled together, buried friends together, and earned the right to trust one another in ways that civilians would never fully understand. They were not prepared for Maya Collins. She walked in at 0700 on a Tuesday morning, carrying a notebook, a single manila folder, and a small black government identification badge clipped to the front pocket of a gray blazer. She was 35 years old, medium height, with dark eyes that moved through the room like a camera lens, quietly, methodically missing nothing. She wore no uniform. She carried no sidearm. Her hair was pulled back in a plain knot, and her shoes were flat-soled and practical, in the way that said she had walked long distances in difficult places without bothering to complain about it. She did not introduce herself immediately. She stood at the front of the room, looked at the men in front of her, and waited. The wait lasted exactly 4 seconds before Commander Derek Vaughn spoke. "You're the investigator they sent." I didn't mean it as a question. He meant it as a statement of disappointment carefully worded so it could not be challenged directly. Vaughn was 42, broad-shouldered, with a jaw built like load-bearing architecture, and a voice that had once talked a wounded operator through 40 minutes of enemy fire while waiting for extraction. He had been commanding SEAL units for 9 years. He had led 23 classified operations, survived 4 of them, under conditions that should have been unsurvivable, and been awarded the Silver Star on 2 separate occasions. I was not a man who believed that answers came in manila folders carried by women in gray blazers. "I'm the investigator," Maya said. "Maya Collins. I've been assigned by the Joint Special Operations Command to conduct a formal review of the operation that was compromised on March 4th. "We know what you're here for," Vaughn said. "What we don't know is why they sent someone who has never operated in this environment." The room laughed. Not loudly. SEAL operators were not generally the type to laugh loudly at anything, but the laughter was there, careful and controlled like everything else about them. It traveled through the room in the form of exchanged glances, small exhaled breaths, and the particular kind of half-smile that professional men use when they believe they are being tolerant of something beneath them. Maya did not react. She opened her notebook to the first page, clicked her pen once, and said, "I'm going to need access to all communication logs from February 22nd through March 4th. All of them, not the ones that were formatted for the after-action report. The originals." Silence. It was a specific kind of silence. The kind that meant she had said something that landed harder than anyone expected. Vaughn leaned forward slightly. "You understand those records are classified at a level that requires separate authorization." "I have that authorization," Maya said. "It's on page 3 of the packet you received this morning." A beat. Then Vaughn turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Patrick Hale, who reached for a folder on the table, opened it, and read for a moment, before looking up with an expression that said the packet was in fact exactly what she claimed it was. Vaughn looked back at her. "Fine," he said. "You'll have access to the logs." He said it the way a man says something when he has no choice but to say it cleanly, with the tone still carrying the message that it didn't matter that she could look at every record they had, and it would still add up to nothing, because these were his men, and his men did not compromise operations. Maya wrote something in her notebook and did not respond. That was the first mini-climax, the moment the room understood, without being able to explain it, that this review was not going to go the way they expected. The second thing she asked for was personnel files. Not just the operators. Support staff. Communications officers. The two intelligence liaisons, who had been attached to Team 7 since January. The logistics coordinator. The armory supervisor. Everyone who had touched the March 4th operation in any capacity. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Ramon Casillas. 12 years in the teams, twice deployed to Afghanistan, once to the Horn of Africa, and a man who had exactly zero patience for what he privately considered bureaucratic theater. Looked at Maya across the table and said, "You going to tell us what exactly you're looking for?" "Not yet," Maya said. "And why is that?" "Because when people know what someone is looking for, they shape the information to fit the answer. I prefer to see everything before I decide what I'm looking for." Casillas looked at Vaughn. Vaughn said nothing. The look between them lasted 2 seconds and communicated everything they both believed. She was performing a role she didn't understand, following a methodology designed by people who had never been in the field, chasing the kind of ghosts that analysts created when they needed something to justify their existence. Maya had seen that look before. Not just from SEAL operators. She had seen it from station chiefs in 4 different countries, from colonels who believed rank substituted for insight, and from men who had made themselves so comfortable inside their own certainty that they had stopped being able to see what was actually in front of them. She had learned a long time ago to find that look useful. She began with the communication logs. The logs from February 22nd through March 4th represented 11 days of operational communication, encrypted channel traffic, satellite relay transmissions, command-to-field updates, and the kind of technical back and forth that most people would need a specialist to even read. Maya read them herself. She spent 6 hours on the first day, alone, in a small conference room that had been assigned to her use with the door closed, going through every page of the raw logs. Not the formatted summaries, not the after-action reconstruction. The originals. By the end of the 3rd hour, she had found the first thing that didn't fit. It was small, easy to miss. The kind of detail that anyone reviewing the logs for the first time would assume was a formatting artifact or a transmission timing error. A specific communication packet sent on February 25th, 3 days before the March 4th operation, that carried a timestamp 11 minutes ahead of its logged sequence position. 11 minutes. It meant the packet had been sent before the event that supposedly triggered it. That was not a transmission error. That was someone sending information they shouldn't have had yet. Maya circled it in the margin of her notebook, wrote 3 words beside it. Source path recipient, and kept reading. By the 6th hour, she had found 4 more anomalies, each one individually explainable. Together they formed a pattern that made her stop reading, set the notebook on the table, and look at the wall for 30 seconds. Because the pattern she was seeing meant that the March 4th operation had not been compromised by external intelligence collection. It had been compromised from inside. Someone within the chain of command, someone with access to operational details at the planning level, had fed information to a third party. She didn't know who yet. She needed more, but she knew how it had been done. On the 2nd day, she asked to observe a training session. The SEALs were running a close-quarters battle drill in one of the compound's interior training structures, a realistic building with movable walls and pop-up targets designed to simulate urban engagement scenarios. Vaughn permitted her to observe from a designated platform above the exercise floor, which was his way of managing the situation without denying her access outright. She watched from above for 40 minutes. What she noticed had nothing to do with shooting. She was watching communication behavior specifically. She was watching who talked to whom during the pre-exercise briefing, who held back information during the debrief, and who positioned themselves physically in ways that allowed maximum monitoring of other people's movements without appearing to do so. She was watching one person in particular, Lieutenant Marcus Delaney. Delaney was 31, quiet, technically proficient in the way that people who move through institutions carefully tend to be proficient. He had an excellent service record. His efficiency reports were uniformly strong. He had never been cited for any disciplinary matter. He spoke only when necessary and listened with the specific kind of attentiveness that looks like conscientiousness, but is actually something else. The careful listening of someone who is not just absorbing information, but cataloging it. Maya had seen that behavior before, in different contexts, in different places. She knew what it usually meant. She wrote his name in her notebook, added a question mark, kept watching. On the evening of the second day, Vaughn came to find her. He didn't knock. He opened the door of the conference room, stepped inside, and looked at the wall where she had taped a hand-drawn timeline, not classified documents, just her own notes reconstructed into a visual sequence, and studied it for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "My men are uncomfortable with what you're doing." "I understand," Maya said. "Do you?" He came further into the room, crossed his arms, and looked at her directly in a way that was designed to be uncomfortable. "Because what I'm hearing is that you are treating this investigation like everyone in this unit is a suspect." "Everyone in this unit is a person of interest," Maya said calmly. "That's different from a suspect. It means everyone gets the same standard of consideration until the evidence narrows the field." "That is not how we operate." "I know how you operate," Maya said. "You operate on trust, and that trust is well-earned and valuable, and has kept your men alive in places where no one else would have survived. But trust is not an investigation methodology. And right now, the thing that compromised your operation is hiding inside the trust this unit has in itself." Vaughn went very still. "Say that again," he said. "The information that burned March 4th didn't come from outside your perimeter," Maya said. "It came from inside. Someone in your chain of command fed operational details to a third party before the mission launched. I have preliminary evidence that points to that conclusion. I need another 72 hours to identify the source with certainty." For a long moment, Vaughn didn't move. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than it had been. "You're sure?" "I'm sure the evidence exists. I'm not yet sure who it points to. That's the difference between what I know and what I'll tell you when I'm finished." He looked at her. She looked back. "What do you need?" he said. "Access to personnel financial records for the last 18 months, and the duty logs for the week preceding March 4th. Those require—" "I have the authorization," Maya said. "It's covered under the same packet." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "I'll have them in your room by morning." He turned to leave. "Commander," Maya said. He stopped. "Don't tell anyone I asked for those specific records." He turned back. The question was on his face before he asked it. "Because if the person I'm looking at hears that I'm looking at financial records, they will move money," Maya said. "And then I lose the trail." Vaughn stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he nodded once and left. The third mini-climax had arrived and departed quietly, like all the significant ones. The financial records arrived at 0600 the next morning. Maya was already awake. She started with the 18-month summary and worked backward, which is not how most investigators work. Most investigators start at the beginning and build toward the present. Maya started at the most recent data and looked for the point where normal behavior changed. She found it in month 7, a sequence of small transfers. Each one, individually, unremarkable. Each one falling just below the reporting threshold that would trigger an automatic flag in the financial monitoring system. Each one directed to a holding account registered in a different name. The transfers were spaced irregularly, which made them harder to pattern match. But they were consistent in size. And they had started exactly 6 weeks before the first operational anomaly she had found in the communication logs. 6 weeks before someone started leaking information money had started moving. That was not coincidence. She sat with that for a moment. Because what she was looking at now was not a theory, it was evidence. Specific, traceable, documentable evidence that someone inside SEAL Team 7's extended command structure had been receiving payments in exchange for operational intelligence. The name the holding account traced to was not Marcus Delaney. It traced to a name she hadn't looked at carefully yet, a name that appeared in her personnel files as a non-operational support figure, someone who moved through the unit's structure in a background capacity that made them almost invisible. Captain Gerald Weston, the unit's intelligence liaison officer. She spent the next 4 hours tracing every point of contact between Gerald Weston and the operational planning process for March 4th. And what she found made her sit back in her chair and press her hands flat on the table. Weston had access to the mission's route data timeline and insertion method. He had been in the planning sessions. He had signed off on the intelligence assessment that cleared the operation to proceed. He had submitted that assessment 26 hours before launch. And 22 hours before launch, someone had anonymously relayed the insertion route to an adversarial communications network. 4 hours. That was the gap between Weston's assessment submission and the leak. 4 hours sitting inside a trusted command structure to make a phone call, send a message, and burn an operation that 11 men had spent 6 weeks preparing for. 11 men who had trusted the intelligence they were given. 11 men who had gone into the field believing the picture was accurate. 3 of whom had come back with injuries that would take months to heal. Maya wrote Weston's name at the top of her timeline and drew a single line connecting every anomaly she had found across 3 days of review. Every line connected to him. The question she faced now was how to move forward. She had evidence, strong preliminary evidence, but evidence strong enough to charge an officer with intelligence compromise required corroboration from a source. She hadn't yet accessed the actual communications server that had transmitted the leak. Getting access to that server required a warrant-level authorization that went above her current clearance bracket. She could request it, but that request would take time. And time was the one thing that worked against her here, because the longer she waited, the higher the probability that Weston, who was still operating inside the unit's daily structure, would detect that something had shifted in the investigation's focus. She needed to move faster than the system normally allowed, which meant she needed Vaughn. She found him at the firing range at 1100 hours, running qualification drills with 3 of his operators. She stood at the edge of the range until he noticed her and signaled the drill to pause. He walked toward her, pulling off his ear protection. "Tell me you have something," he said. "I have everything," Maya said. "I need you to authorize emergency access to the unit's classified communications server. The actual server, not the formatted logs." Vaughn's eyes sharpened. "That access requires a standing flag from JSOC." "I know, which is why I need you to make a call to Admiral Farrington in the next 30 minutes and tell him that your investigation has produced a credible and time-sensitive finding that requires emergency corroboration access." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who is it?" "I need the server access before I give you a name," Maya said. "Because if I'm right, I need to be completely right. Not 95% right, completely. And if you're wrong, then I owe someone an apology and the investigation starts over, but I'm not wrong." The way she said it was not arrogant. It was simply the same flat certainty she had carried into the room on the first morning, the certainty of someone who had looked at enough evidence to know the difference between a trail and a conclusion. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. 30 minutes, he said. "Thank you," Maya said, and turned to go back to the conference room. Behind her, she heard Vaughn already pulling out his phone. Admiral Farrington granted the access in 18 minutes. Maya had the server data in front of her by 11:50. She found the transmission at 12:04. It was there buried inside a technical routing sequence that had been deliberately structured to look like a maintenance ping from an automated diagnostic system. To anyone performing a routine log review, it was invisible. It looked like nothing. A small packet of data moving through a scheduled maintenance pathway. But it wasn't a maintenance ping. It was a message. And inside the message, stripped of its technical wrapper, was a 47-word summary of the March 4th operation's insertion route timeline and primary objective. 47 words that had gotten 3 men hurt. The account that sent the message was registered to a service terminal assigned to Captain Gerald Weston's intelligence workstation. She had him. She closed the server log, gathered everything she had, and went to find Vaughn. She laid the evidence on his desk in a sequence: the financial records first, then the communication anomalies, then the server transmission, then the timeline connecting all three. She walked him through it without rushing, without simplifying, without softening anything. Vaughn sat behind his desk and did not speak for almost 4 minutes after she finished. When he finally looked up, his face had changed in the way that faces change when something a person believed about the world turns out to have been wrong. He was in every planning meeting, Vaughn said. Not to Maya, to himself. Yes, Maya said. He signed the intelligence assessment. Yes. He was the one who told me the route was clean. A pause. Yes, Maya said. Vaughn's jaw was tight. He looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite disbelief, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. How long did it take you, he said, to find the transmission? About a week total, accounting for the access delays. My unit spent 2 months looking at technical failure as the cause, Vaughn said. 2 months. You were looking at the right question with the wrong frame, Maya said quietly. You were asking whether the system failed. The right question was whether someone made the system appear to fail. Vaughn looked at the documents on his desk. He reached out and placed one finger on the transmission record, the 47 words, and held it there for a moment. I need to call Admiral Farrington, he said. Yes, Maya said. And I need to be in the room when you do. He looked up, a question in his expression. Because what happens in the next hour will determine whether Weston has time to destroy anything else, Maya said. Speed matters more than protocol right now. Another pause. Then Vaughn nodded, once picked up the phone and said, Sit down. Maya sat. And for the first time since she had walked into Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek, no one in the room doubted why she was there. The call to Farrington lasted 11 minutes. Maya listened. She spoke only twice, once to clarify a technical point about the server transmission's routing architecture, and once to confirm the authorization chain on her financial access warrant. When the call ended, Vaughn set the phone down on his desk and looked at her. He's authorizing immediate detention pending a full JAG investigation, Vaughn said. Good, Maya said. Weston is on base right now, in the intelligence section. Then the next 20 minutes are critical, Maya said. He needs to be isolated before anyone tells him what's happening. If he hears anything at all, he may have the ability to trigger a dead drop protocol that buries the financial trail. Vaughn was already standing. Come with me, he said. And he said it the way a person says something when they have recalibrated completely, not as an afterthought, not as a concession, but as a statement of fact. Maya stood, gathered her notebook, and followed him out of the office into the hallway, where 3 of his most trusted operators were already waiting at his signal. She had walked into this facility 3 days ago, carrying nothing but a worn notebook and a manila folder, and 12 SEAL operators had measured her in a glance and found her weightless. She had spent 3 days turning that assumption into a weapon. She was not done yet. But the most important part of the next hour would not be the confrontation with Weston. It would be the moment coming soon, inevitable now, when every person in this unit would have to look at what they had assumed about her and decide what to do with the distance between that assumption and the truth. That moment was exactly 7 steps ahead. Maya walked toward it without hesitating. The moment. Vaughn nodded and said, Come with me. Every operator in that hallway felt it, that particular shift in the air when a commander stops leading from certainty and starts leading from something harder, from the place where certainty used to be. Maya followed him without speaking. She had learned a long time ago that the seconds immediately after a revelation were not the time to say anything. They were the time to let people absorb, to let the weight of what they had just heard settle into the body before the mind tried to rationalize it away. Because the mind, when threatened, will rationalize anything. It will build walls faster than any enemy. And the only thing that stops it is time, the 2 or 3 seconds between hearing something true and deciding you can't afford to believe it. Vaughn was a strong man. He gave it exactly 2 seconds. Then he stopped walking, turned to face her in the hallway and said, Before we go any further, I need to understand something. Ask, Maya said. The financial records, the server transmission, the timeline you showed me. He paused. All of that is solid. All of it is documented, traceable, and will hold under JAG scrutiny. And you're certain the source terminal connects to Weston specifically, not a shared workstation, not an access sharing arrangement. The terminal has a biometric login requirement, Maya said. Access logs show it was signed into under Weston's credentials at 22:47 hours on March 3rd. The transmission occurred at 22:51. 4 minutes later, he signed out. Vaughn looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not disbelief, but the particular pain of a man who has trusted completely and been shown with 4 minutes of documented time exactly how that trust was used. He was at the team dinner that night, Vaughn said quietly. I saw him there. He left early, Maya said. Told Senior Chief Casillas he had a headache. The silence between them lasted exactly 3 seconds. Casillas will remember that, Vaughn said. Not a question, a confirmation. He was already assembling the corroborating picture in his mind, placing Weston's face back into every memory of the previous months, and watching the expression change. He will, Maya said. And when the JAG team interviews him, that memory will matter. Vaughn exhaled through his nose, a controlled, deliberate breath of the kind that men use when they are managing something large and painful in a space too small for it. Let's move, he said. They found Weston in the intelligence section at his desk. He was reading a report when they came through the door, or he appeared to be reading. Maya noticed in the first half-second that his eyes were not tracking across the page the way a person's eyes move when they are actually reading. They were fixed. Stationary. The eyes of a man who was performing the appearance of calm, while something underneath ran very fast in a very different direction. He looked up when Vaughn entered. Commander, he said. Professional, even. I wasn't expecting you. Gerald, Vaughn said. He used the first name. Maya noted it. Vaughn was a last-name man in professional settings, and the shift to a first name meant he was doing something deliberate. Keeping it human. Keeping the conversation in a register that hadn't yet become adversarial. Because Vaughn was good at this. Whatever else he was good at controlling a room. I need you to come with me to the conference room, Vaughn said. We have a few things to go over regarding the March 4th review. Weston's eyes moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, to Maya. She had positioned herself 2 steps behind Vaughn's left shoulder, which put her at the edge of Weston's peripheral vision. Close enough to be present, far enough not to be the first thing he processed. Of course, Weston said. He closed the report he wasn't reading, pushed back his chair and stood. He was smooth. Maya had to give him that. He was very, very smooth. But he had looked at her for 1 extra half-second before he looked back at Vaughn. And in that half-second, something had passed through his expression that he had not been able to control completely. Not guilt, not fear, something more specific than either. Recognition. He knew she had found something. I didn't know yet how much. But he knew the shape of the situation had changed, and the change was connected to the quiet woman in the gray blazer, standing 2 steps behind his commanding officer. Maya kept her face neutral and said nothing. They walked to the conference room together. Vaughn in front, Weston in the middle, Maya behind. 3 operators from Team 7 fell in behind them in the hallway positioned by Vaughn's earlier instruction. Not aggressive, not surrounding, simply present. The kind of presence that communicates without a word being spoken, that the parameters of a situation have changed. Weston noticed them. His stride didn't change, but his shoulders tightened by a fraction, the kind of micro-tension that a person who hasn't spent years learning to read bodies would miss entirely. Maya did not miss it. The conference room was the same one Maya had used for 3 days of review, her timeline, still on the wall, her notes still arranged across the table. She had not cleared them, deliberately. Because the moment Weston walked in and saw the timeline, saw his own name at the top of it, saw the lines connecting every anomaly to every document she had assembled, she would learn something that no interview question could tell her. She would learn exactly how much he already knew, she knew. He stepped through this door. He saw the wall. He stopped. 1 second. 2. His face did something that it took genuine discipline not to react to it, went completely blank in the specific way that faces go blank when a person's internal calculation is running at maximum speed, and they have redirected every available resource to that calculation, leaving nothing spare for expression. Then he turned to Vaughn and said very carefully, "What is this?" "Sit down, Gerald," Vaughn said. "I'd like to understand what I'm looking at before I sit down." The second time Vaughn said it, it was not a request. It was the voice of a man who had led 23 classified operations and knew with the precision of long experience exactly how much weight to put into 2 words. Weston sat. Maya moved to the side of the table, stood rather than sat, and opened her notebook. "Captain Weston," she said, "I'm going to ask you some questions about your activities during the week preceding March 4th. I want to be clear that this conversation is being recorded and that you have the right to request legal representation before answering anything." Weston looked at her, then at Vaughn, then back at her. "Am I being accused of something?" "You're being questioned," Maya said. "The distinction matters." "Then I'd like to know the basis for the questioning." "The basis," Maya said, "is a financial transfer record, a classified server transmission, and a 14-day communication log that collectively suggest a pattern of activity inconsistent with your role and your clearance obligations." She set 3 documents on the table in front of him face down. She did not turn them over yet. Weston looked at the documents. He looked at Maya. Something moved through his face. She could see him making a decision, could see the calculation happening in real time, the assessment of how much she had versus how much she appeared to have, the gap between those 2 things, and whether that gap was wide enough to be useful. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That is your right," Maya said, "and we will arrange that immediately." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "But before we do, I want you to understand something." She reached out and turned over the first document. The financial transfer record. 18 months of small movements. His holding account. His name, the real one, not the registered alias cross-referenced in the corroborating bank data she had obtained through the emergency warrant. Weston looked at it. His breathing changed, slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. "The transfer architecture is sophisticated," Maya said. "I want to give you credit for that. The threshold spacing, the irregular timing intervals, the alias chain. Whoever designed it understood how automated monitoring systems pattern match. It was built to be invisible." She turned over the second document. The server transmission log. The 47 words. The timestamp. The biometric access record. "But invisible to automated systems isn't the same as invisible," Maya said. "Automated systems look for the pattern. I looked for the gap between what the pattern should show and what it actually showed. That gap is smaller than you'd think. 4 minutes in this case." Weston said nothing. His lawyer instinct had taken complete control. Now she could see it. He was not going to give her anything voluntarily. He had shut down the part of himself that might react emotionally and handed the situation over to the cold strategic part that was already working on survival. She respected the discipline. She had expected it. She turned over the third document. The timeline. Every anomaly. Every connection. 14 days of evidence assembled into a single, coherent sequence that started with money moving and ended with 3 men getting hurt on a mission that should have been clean. "Captain Weston," Maya said, 3 operators from this unit sustained injuries on March 4th because someone told the opposing force exactly where they would be and exactly when they would arrive. That someone had access to the planning sessions, signed off on the intelligence assessment, and sent 47 words from a biometrically secured terminal at 22:51 hours on March 3rd. She closed her notebook. "I have everything I need," she said. "This conversation is a courtesy, not an opportunity." The room was completely silent. Vaughn stood against the wall with his arms at his sides, not crossed, not aggressive, just still, and his face held the expression of a man watching something he needed to see, no matter how much it cost him to watch it. Weston looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked up at Vaughn. "Derek," he said, and the use of the first name was not professional. It was personal, deliberate, an appeal to 12 years of working alongside each other, of shared deployments and shared history, and the particular bond that forms between men who have operated in dangerous places together. Vaughn looked back at him and said nothing. "Derek, you've known me for 12 years. "I have," Vaughn said. "You know the kind of man I am." "I thought I did," Vaughn said. His voice was quiet, controlled. "I'm looking at documents right now that are asking me to reconsider that." Something shifted in Weston's face. The appeal had not landed the way he hoped, and the part of him that had been counting on the relationship as a variable in his calculation was now recalibrating without it. He turned back to Maya. "I want my lawyer," he said. "We'll make the call now," Maya said. She looked at one of the operators in the doorway and nodded. The operator stepped out into the hallway. Weston sat in his chair and looked at the documents in front of him and did not speak again. But his hands flat on the table had tightened, the knuckles slightly white, the only visible sign of everything that was happening underneath the surface. Maya closed her notebook, picked up her pen, and wrote the time in the margin. 13:47 hours. The case was not closed. The JAG process would take weeks, possibly months. There would be lawyers and hearings and the long institutional machinery of military justice that ground slowly, and when it worked correctly, ground thoroughly. But the moment that mattered, the moment the evidence became undeniable, and the person responsible sat across a table and could no longer perform innocence. That moment had already happened, and Maya had been the one to build it. Vaughn came to find her 20 minutes later. She was in the hallway outside the conference room, standing against the wall with her notebook open, writing the final sequence of her preliminary report. Weston was still inside with 2 operators posted at the door. His lawyer had been called. The JAG duty officer had been notified. Admiral Farrington's office had been briefed. The machine was moving. Vaughn stopped beside her. He stood there for a moment without speaking, which was becoming a pattern between them. The particular silence of a man who had more to say than he had words for, standing next to a woman who had learned to wait for people to find their own way to what they needed to say. "The team is going to have questions," he said finally. "I know. They're going to want to know how this happened, how someone was inside the unit for this long and nobody saw it." "That's the right question," Maya said. "And the honest answer is that the unit's cohesion, the thing that makes SEAL teams effective, is also the thing that makes this kind of penetration possible. Trust at that level doesn't leave room for the kind of lateral suspicion that would catch what Weston was doing. He knew that. He used it." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like you're saying the unit's strength is also its vulnerability." "Every strength is also a vulnerability," Maya said. "The question is knowing which one is being exploited." Vaughn looked at her. The expression on his face was different now from anything she had seen in the previous 3 days. The dismissal was completely gone. Not replaced by warmth. Vaughn was not a warm man particularly, but replaced by something more durable than warmth. A kind of assessment. The look of a person recalibrating the parameters of what they believe is possible. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. Maya looked at him steadily. "Long enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters right now," she said. "Because the question you're actually asking is whether I've seen this before. And the answer to that one is yes. Different units, different people, different methods. The architecture of betrayal from inside a closed system follows a pattern. It always has. And you know what that pattern looks like." "I know what it feels like when something doesn't fit," Maya said. "Most people learn to explain away the things that don't fit. I learned to stop doing that." Vaughn nodded slowly. Not in agreement with her methodology, something more personal than that. The nod of a man who was honestly asking himself for the first time what he had explained away. "Casillas is going to take this hard," Vaughn said. "Senior Chief Casillas." The man who had sat across from Maya on the first morning and demanded to know what she was looking for. The man who had been physically closest to Weston inside the unit's social structure, who had considered Weston reliable, competent, and trustworthy, in the specific way that SEAL operators extend trust to the people who support their missions. "Casillas is going to be angry," Maya said. "And then he's going to be thorough. He'll review everything. Every interaction. Every conversation. He'll go back through his own memory looking for the thing he missed. That's the right response. Should I let him? Yes, Maya said. Don't protect him from it. The anger and the review are how he processes it in a way that makes him better rather than bitter. Vaughn looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. You do this a lot, he said. Tell commanders how to handle their people. I tell investigators how to find the truth, Maya said. Sometimes the truth involves how people are going to react to what they learn. You can't separate those things. He almost smiled. Not quite. But the muscles around his eyes changed in a way that meant something close to it. My executive officer wants to know your full background, Vaughn said. Lieutenant Commander Hale. He's been asking questions since day one. He should ask them through JSOC, Maya said. Most of the answers are classified anyway. He's not going to like that. He doesn't need to like it, Maya said. He needs to run a clean unit going forward, and that's going to require him to accept that some of the oversight coming his way won't be fully transparent. That's a hard adjustment. He'll make it. Vaughn was quiet again. Then, I owe you an apology. Maya looked at him. The first morning, he said. The way I spoke to you when you came in. The way my team. Commander, Maya said. He stopped. I don't need the apology. You deserve it. Maybe, she said. But what I actually need is for you to use what happened here to make this unit harder to penetrate. Not because it makes you feel better about the last 3 days. Because 3 of your men are still recovering, and the reason they got hurt was a problem that existed inside your command structure. Fix the structure. That matters more than the apology. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. And something settled in his face, a kind of respect that was not comfortable or warm, because genuine respect rarely is. It was the respect of a person who has been correctly measured by someone else and who has the integrity to acknowledge it. Yes, ma'am, he said. Maya blinked. It was the only visible reaction she allowed herself. In 3 days he had gone from, you don't belong here, to yes, ma'am. She turned back to her notebook and kept writing. The call from JSOC came at 1600 hours. Maya took it in the small conference room alone, the door closed, the timeline still on the wall behind her. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Sandra Merritt, her direct superior at Joint Special Operations Command, a woman who had spent 20 years in intelligence work and who had the particular economy of language that comes from 2 decades of saying exactly what needs to be said and nothing more. Where are we? Merritt said. Subject is in custody pending JAG, Maya said. Evidence package is complete. I need another 48 hours on site to finish the preliminary report and brief the command structure on the procedural gaps that allowed this. You have them, Merritt said. Farrington called me. He's pleased. Good. He also asked me how long you've been in the field. A pause. What did you tell him? Maya said. I told him long enough, Merritt said. He didn't push it. Maya almost smiled. The unit commander, Merritt continued. Vaughn, what's your read? Strong, Maya said. He made the wrong first call on me, but he corrected fast and he corrected completely. Once the evidence was in front of him, he didn't protect his own assumptions. He moved. That's the quality that matters. Recommendation. Keep him in command, Maya said without hesitation. Brief him fully on the procedural reforms, require a 6-month structural audit of the intelligence liaison embedded system, and don't make him feel like the unit failed. Because the unit didn't fail. The unit was betrayed. There's a difference, and how leadership frames it will determine whether Team 7 comes back stronger or just comes back. A beat on the other end of the line. I'll pass that along, Merritt said. Thank you, Maya. A pause. Good work. The call ended. Maya set the phone on the table and looked at the timeline on the wall. Every line, every connection. 3 days of work assembled into a picture that had started as an anomaly in a communication log and ended with a man sitting in a conference room waiting for his lawyer. She thought about Vaughn saying he owed her an apology. She thought about the room on the first morning. 12 operators deciding in a single glance what kind of person she was, what kind of threat she represented, and concluding the answer to both questions was nothing. She thought about what it cost to walk into that room anyway. Not the walking in that part was easy. The part that required something was what came before it. The years of working in places where no one knew who she was or what she had done, where the ignorance of the people around her was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a tool to be used. The years of learning to be underestimated. Of understanding that the moment people stop seeing you clearly is the moment you can see them most clearly. She had learned that lesson in a different country, under different circumstances, working a different case that had ended badly enough to change the way she thought about what intelligence work actually required. Not aggression, not confrontation, patience, precision. The willingness to be invisible long enough to become the last thing anyone expected. She picked up her notebook and began writing the final section of her preliminary report. Outside the door, she could hear the unit's movement operators in the hallway. Voices low, the specific sound of a team processing something that had altered its understanding of itself. She knew that sound. She had heard it before. It was not a defeated sound. It was a recalibrating one. That was the difference. And it mattered. At 18:30 hours, Senior Chief Cassilis knocked on the conference room door. Maya looked up. "Come in," she said. He came in and closed the door behind him. He stood just inside the room, not aggressive, not exactly comfortable, with his arms at his sides and his jaw tight, in the way it gets when a man is holding something that he doesn't have words for yet, but needs to put somewhere. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," Maya said. "The first day, when I asked you what you were looking for." He paused. "You said you preferred to see everything before you decided what you were looking for." "Yes." "Did you already know what you were looking for?" Maya set her pen down. "I knew what kind of thing I was looking for," she said. "I didn't know who yet." "But you suspected it wasn't a technical failure." "I suspected it from the first morning," she said. The pattern of the March 4th failure was inconsistent with a technical compromise. Technical failures have a specific signature. What happened on March 4th had a different one. Cassilis nodded slowly. He looked at the timeline on the wall. He looked at it for a long time, his eyes moving through the sequence of dates and events, the way a person reads something they know they need to understand completely before they can put it down. "I vouched for him," Cassilis said. "Weston. 6 months ago there was a routine clearance review. I vouched for him." "I know," Maya said. "You saw that in the records." "Yes." He looked at her. "And you didn't, and it didn't change what the evidence showed," Maya said. "A vouching record tells me someone was trusted. It doesn't tell me the trust was wrong to give. People who betray institutions are almost always trusted before they betray them. That's the nature of the position. You had no reason to know. The evidence that something was wrong didn't exist at the time of that review." Cassilis was quiet. "That's not going to make it easier," he said. "No," Maya said. "It's not. But it's true. And the true version is the one you have to work with." He looked at her for a long moment, directly, with the kind of assessment that 12 years in special operations builds into a person. The ability to look at someone and measure what they're actually made of beneath whatever surface they're presenting. "You're good at this," he said. "Yes," Maya said simply. "No false modesty. No deflection." She had learned a long time ago that false modesty in this context was its own form of dishonesty, a way of managing someone else's discomfort at the expense of the truth. Cassilis almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to the surface, but it almost did. "The commander wants to know if you'll brief the full team tomorrow morning," he said. "Not the investigation findings. JAG handles that. The procedural part. What they should have been looking for. What they can do differently." Maya considered it. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." 0700, Cassilis said. "Same briefing room as the first day." He turned to go. "Senior Chief," Maya said. He stopped. "The thing you missed," she said. "Weston worked very hard to make sure you missed it. That's not an excuse. But it's the context. Don't spend so much time looking backward at the gap that you stop moving forward through it." Casillas stood in the doorway for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and walked out. Maya turned back to her report. The room was quiet. The timeline was on the wall. Outside, the unit was recalibrating painful necessary, the kind of recalibration that either breaks something or makes it considerably harder to break. She knew which one it would be here. She had seen Vaughn move. She had seen Casillas come through the door and ask the right question. She had seen a team beginning the work of understanding what had happened to it, which was the only honest place to start. They would be better, not because the betrayal hadn't hurt them, because of how they chose to carry the weight of it forward. Maya finished the last line of her preliminary report, closed her notebook, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Tomorrow morning. The same room. The same 12 operators. The difference was that this time when she walked through that door, nobody would be measuring her in a glance and deciding she was weightless. They would be waiting, and what she told them in that room would determine whether the next 11 days, or the next operation, or the next time someone quiet walked into their world with a notebook and a folder, whether any of those things ended differently. She picked up her pen. She had more to write. She was at the table by 06:30, 30 minutes before the briefing. 30 minutes before 12. SEAL operators filed into the same room where 3 days ago they had looked at her and seen nothing worth taking seriously. She sat with her notebook open and her coffee untouched, and she reviewed one final time what she was going to say and what she was going to leave out. Because there was something she had decided not to put in the preliminary report. Something she had found on the second night buried in the server data that changed the shape of the case in a direction she had not yet shared with Vaughn, or with Merritt, or with anyone. She had found a second account, not Weston's account. A different one. Registered to a different alias, routed through a different financial architecture, smaller in volume, but more recent in activity. The last transfer had occurred 11 days ago, which was 5 days after Weston had been identified as the primary subject of her investigation. 5 days after she had arrived on base, which meant one of two things. Either Weston had a partner who was still active, or the person who had recruited Weston in the first place was watching the investigation unfold in real time and moving money in response to it. Either way, the case was not closed, and Maya had spent the previous night deciding how much of that she was going to share this morning with 12 men who were already carrying more weight than most people accumulate in a lifetime, and whose commander had just spent 24 hours doing the hardest kind of leadership work, the kind where you have to tell people that the ground they trusted was never as solid as they believed. She decided she would give them everything they needed to understand the procedural failures, and she would hold the second account until she had enough to know what it meant. Not to protect herself, to protect the investigation. Because the second account, if it was what she thought it was, pointed somewhere considerably more dangerous than Gerald Weston. They came in at 0658. All 12 of them, plus Vaughn and Hale. They moved differently than they had on the first morning. Not slower exactly, but with less of the particular physical confidence that comes from absolute certainty in one's own understanding of a situation. They had lost something in the last 24 hours. Not their capability, not their professionalism, but the specific kind of confidence that doesn't know it's built on an incomplete picture. That was not a bad thing to lose. Maya stood when they were all seated. "I'm going to talk to you this morning about process," she said. "Not about Weston. JAG handles Weston. What I want to talk about is the architecture that made what Weston did possible, because that architecture still exists. And if you don't understand it, it will be exploitable again by the next person who decides to use it." The room was completely quiet. Nobody laughed. Nobody exchanged glances. They were listening the way professionals listen when they have been shown with documented and irrefutable evidence that they missed something important. The intelligence liaison embedded system, Maya said, is structurally sound in its design. What it lacks is lateral verification. Weston had access to operational planning data without any independent check on how he used that data between the moment he received it and the moment he submitted his assessment. That gap, the gap between receipt and assessment, is where the compromise occurred, repeatedly, over 14 months. Senior Chief Casillas, sitting in the second row, leaned forward slightly. 14 months, he said. He was doing this for 14 months. The financial record goes back 18, Maya said. But the operational data transfers begin 14 months ago. The first 6 months appear to have been preparation, establishing the financial architecture, testing the transmission method, confirming that the monitoring systems weren't flagging the activity. The room absorbed that. 14 months. The number sat in the air with a specific weight, the weight of every mission that had run during those 14 months. Every operation that had been planned and executed with Weston, somewhere in the chain, every moment where the team had trusted the intelligence picture they were given without knowing that the picture had a crack in it. Lieutenant Commander Hale Vaughn's executive officer, a lean, precise man who had spent the last 3 days watching Maya with an expression that had moved through skepticism, frustration, reluctant attention, and finally, something approaching respect, spoke from the left side of the table. How many operations were compromised? March 4th is the only confirmed operational compromise, Maya said. The other transfers appear to have been intelligence assessments, route data, surveillance schedules, target profiles that were passed before they were acted upon. In most cases, the intelligence aged out before it could be operationally exploited. March 4th was the exception because the timeline was compressed. So we got lucky, Hale said. 12 times we got lucky, and once we didn't. That's one way to frame it, Maya said. The other way is that the system was being tested. The early transfers were probes checking how the intelligence was being used on the other end, calibrating the relationship between what Weston could provide and what the receiving party considered valuable. March 4th was the first time the relationship matured to the point of direct operational use. Hale looked at Vaughn. Vaughn looked back at him with the expression of a man who has already processed this particular piece of information and is watching someone else arrive at it for the first time. Which means March 4th was not a peak event, Hale said slowly. It was a beginning. If the investigation had taken another 6 months, Maya said yes. The room went very still. That was the moment, the one that landed the hardest, harder, even than the arrest, harder than the documents, because it reframed the stakes. Not what had happened, what had almost happened. The version of the next 6 months that no longer existed because a woman with a notebook and a manila folder had walked into their briefing room 3 days ago and refused to be dismissed. Casillas looked at Maya. What do we change? He said. Not combative, not political. Direct, practical, the voice of a man who processes hard things by moving immediately toward what can be fixed. Maya spent the next 40 minutes walking them through it. The specific procedural gaps, the verification protocols that needed implementation, the documentation requirements that would close the window Weston had used. She was precise, and she was fast, and she did not soften anything, because these were not people who needed softening. They needed accuracy, and they needed to trust the source of it. By the time she was finished, the room had asked 31 questions. She had answered every one of them. Vaughn caught her in the hallway afterward. You held something back, he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation delivered flatly, the way Vaughn delivered most things. Maya looked at him. What makes you say that? Because you're precise, Vaughn said. Every answer you gave in there was exactly as long as it needed to be. And when Hale asked about the receiving party, who was on the other end of Weston's transfers, your answer was exactly as long as it needed to be without actually answering the question. Maya said nothing. Vaughn waited. There's a second account, Maya said. He went still. Not Weston's, she said. Different alias, different architecture, smaller volume, more recent activity. The last transfer was 11 days ago. After you arrived. Yes. Vaughn's expression did something controlled and deliberate that contained a significant amount of things he was not going to say out loud in a hallway. You think there's a second person, he said. I think there's a possibility the person who recruited Weston is still active and is aware that the investigation has moved, Maya said, which means I have a window probably narrow to trace the second account before it goes dark. How narrow? Days, Maya said. Maybe less. If the person on the other end is sophisticated enough to have run Weston for 14 months without being detected, they're sophisticated enough to recognize when it's time to cut the financial trail. Vaughn looked at her. A long, measuring look. What do you need? I need access to the classified network's external communication nodes, Maya said. And I need it without filing a formal access request, because a formal request creates a paper trail that shows up in system logs. Vaughn's jaw tightened. You're asking me to authorize an off-record network access. I'm asking you to authorize an emergency access under your standing operational security authority, Maya said, which is different, and which you have the standing to do without a formal request process under the emergency provision in your command charter. I've never used that provision. I know. Most commanders don't. It exists for situations where the standard process creates a vulnerability that outweighs the benefit of the process. And you think this is that situation. I think whoever is on the other end of the second account is watching, Maya said. And a formal access request takes a minimum of 6 hours to process. 6 hours is enough time to move money close accounts and burn every trail I have. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment, and she could see it, the calculation happening, the weight of the decision, the specific responsibility of a commander who has been trained to operate within systems and is being asked to use the edge of one. If I do this and it goes wrong, he said, it goes on my record. Yes, Maya said. It does. She didn't offer to protect him from that. She didn't offer assurances she couldn't guarantee. She had learned that the people worth trusting were the ones who made decisions knowing the full weight of them. Vaughn nodded once. My office, he said. Now. The network access took 11 minutes to authorize and activate. Maya sat at the terminal in Vaughn's office and moved through the external communication nodes with the specific efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions with fewer resources. She wasn't looking for the money this time. This time, the financial trail on the second account was already partially documented. She was looking for the communication signature, the method of contact, the digital fingerprint that would tell her who was receiving the information and from what institutional position. Because the second account's architecture was different from Weston's in one critical way. Weston's account had been designed to move money quietly over time. Standard tradecraft for a long-term asset relationship, small amounts, irregular timing, difficult to pattern match. The second account had been designed for speed. The transfers were larger and less frequent. The architecture was built for rapid movement, not long-term concealment. That meant two things. One, the person behind the second account had a different operational role than Weston, not a long-term embedded asset, but a more direct participant. Two, the speed architecture meant they had operated with the expectation that they would need to move quickly if the situation changed, which meant they had always known this day was possible, which meant they had a contingency, and contingencies in financial tradecraft left traces. Maya found the trace at 0912. It was in the routing metadata of the most recent transfer, the one that had occurred 11 days ago, 5 days after her arrival on base. Buried inside the technical wrapper of the transfer protocol was a single redundant routing code that should not have existed. It was the digital equivalent of a return address written in invisible ink on the back of an envelope. Something a careful person would never include. Something that appeared to be a system artifact, but was, when decoded against the right cipher, a location identifier, a physical location. Maya looked at the location identifier for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Colonel Merritt. Merritt answered on the second ring. Talk to me, Merritt said. I have a location, Maya said. Tied to a second account that's been active for at least 11 days post-arrival. The account architecture is different from Weston's. It's built for speed, not longevity. And the location identifier in the routing metadata is domestic. A pause on Merritt's end. Short, but significant. Domestic, Merritt repeated. Yes. Where domestic? Maya told her. Another pause, longer this time. Maya, Merritt said. That location is inside the Beltway. I know. That changes the scope of this investigation by several orders of magnitude. I know that too. If what you're suggesting is accurate, this isn't a compromised SEAL unit. This is a penetration that goes considerably higher than Weston. Yes, Maya said. That's what I'm suggesting. The silence on Merritt's end lasted 4 seconds, 4 full seconds, which from Sandra Merritt was the equivalent of a long and complicated conversation. Don't move on it yet, Merritt said finally. I need to make 2 calls. Stay on base, stay close to the network access, and do not share this with Vaughn yet. Understood, Maya said. The call ended. Maya set the phone down and looked at the location identifier on the screen. Inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C., someone in Washington had been running Weston. Not a foreign intelligence service operating from overseas. Not an external adversarial network using offshore infrastructure. Someone operating from within the capital's institutional landscape close enough to the machinery of military oversight to know exactly which unit to penetrate, exactly which position to fill, with exactly the right person, and exactly how to structure a financial relationship that would survive 14 months of routine monitoring. That required institutional knowledge. That required access. That required someone who understood how JSOC oversight worked from the inside. Maya sat with that for a long moment. Because the implications of it were not small. They were the kind of implications that, if she was right, would reach considerably further than Gerald Weston's arrest and the procedural reforms she had briefed to Team 7 an hour ago. She was right. She knew she was right the same way she had known every other thing in this investigation, not from certainty for its own sake, but from the accumulated weight of evidence pointing in a single direction with no credible alternative. The question was how far the thread went when she pulled it. Vaughn found her in his office 30 minutes later. She was still at the terminal, but she had closed the network access and was back to her notebook writing in the tight abbreviated shorthand she used when she was moving through something quickly and didn't want to lose the thread. Merritt called me, Vaughn said. Maya looked up. She told me you found something that extends the scope of the investigation, he said. She didn't tell me what. She told you not to ask me directly, Maya said. She told me to give you whatever you need and to keep the information contained within this office. He paused. Which is her way of telling me it's bigger than I want it to be. Yes, Maya said. How much bigger? She looked at him. Measured. Assessed. Made the decision she had been making and remaking for the last 30 minutes about how much to tell him and when. It goes above this unit, she said. Above Little Creek. Possibly above JSOC's standard oversight structure. Vaughn sat down. Not dramatically, he simply sat the way a man sits when the ground has shifted under him and he needs a moment to find his footing again. You're telling me Weston wasn't the top of the chain. I'm telling you Weston was the bottom of it. The room was quiet for a long time. How long before you know more? Vaughn said. Merritt is making calls now. Depending on what she finds, I may need to leave the base within the next 24 hours. And the investigation here is complete from my end, Maya said. The JAG process will run its course. The procedural reforms I briefed this morning need to be implemented within 30 days. I've documented the timeline in the preliminary report. What happens next in the broader investigation is above the unit's scope and will be handled at a different level. Vaughn nodded slowly. Then, can I ask you something personal? Maya looked at him. You can ask. Why do you work the way you work, the invisibility thing? Walking in with no indication of who you actually are, letting people dismiss you. He paused. You clearly don't have to. You could walk in with full credentials and a briefing package, and every room would know immediately what they were dealing with. Maya considered the question. She gave it the respect of actual consideration rather than a prepared answer. When people know who you are, she said finally, they show you who they want you to see. When they think you're nothing, they show you who they actually are. She paused. In my work, the second version is always more useful. And with us, I needed to see how this unit treated someone they believed was powerless, she said. Because how a unit treats powerless people tells you everything about the culture that allowed a Gerald Weston to operate inside it for 14 months without anyone asking the right questions. Vaughn was quiet. And what did you see? he said. I saw a unit that treated dismissal as a default setting, Maya said. Not maliciously, habitually. It's a common pattern in high-performing closed systems. The internal standards are so high that anything outside the known parameters gets categorized as irrelevant. Weston understood that. He used it. He positioned himself as essential, but unexamined, which is exactly where a person needs to be if they're going to do what he did. And how do we fix that? You're already fixing it, Maya said. The fact that you're asking that question is the beginning of the fix. The culture shifts when the people at the top start interrogating their own assumptions. It doesn't shift any other way. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. I told my team this morning, he said, that I owed you more than an apology. You told them that. I told them that the most dangerous assumption a unit can make is that the most capable person in the room is the most obvious one. He paused. I used your name. Maya said nothing. Casillas said you'd probably be annoyed by that, Vaughn said. And there was something in his voice that was the closest thing to lightness she had heard from him in 3 days. Casillas is perceptive, Maya said. He's asking if you'll come back, Vaughn said. After the broader investigation resolves, for a formal consultation on the procedural rebuild. Tell him I'll consider it, Maya said. That means yes, Vaughn said. It means I'll consider it, Maya said. But she said it without the edge that would have made it a refusal, and Vaughn was perceptive enough to hear the difference. The call from Merritt came at 1400. I found the second account's institutional connection, Merritt said. Her voice was different from the morning call, not alarmed exactly, but carrying the specific controlled tension of someone who has turned over a stone and found something underneath it that requires a significant response. Tell me, Maya said. The routing location traces to a server cluster associated with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Operational Oversight Division, Merritt said. 3rd floor West Wing, specific to the Personnel Audit Function. Maya was quiet. The Personnel Audit Function, she repeated. The office responsible for reviewing clearance renewals for JSOC-attached personnel, including intelligence liaison officers, Merritt said. Including specifically the clearance review that was conducted for Gerald Weston 8 months ago. The clearance review that Senior Chief Casillas had contributed to. The one where Weston had been vouched for and cleared without further scrutiny. Someone in the DIA Oversight Division flagged Weston's file for expedited processing, Merritt said, bypassed 2 standard review steps. The flag was inserted by an account that has since been deactivated. But you traced it, Maya said. I traced it, Merritt said. The account belongs to a deputy director, current, still in position. The weight of that landed with a specific and considerable force. A deputy director at the Defense Intelligence Agency had expedited Weston's clearance renewal, had ensured that the man he was running as an asset stayed in place and stayed accessible. Had protected the operation from the inside of the institution designed to prevent exactly that kind of operation. Does the deputy director, Maya said. Not yet, Merritt said. I've contained the information to 3 people including yourself. I'm going to the Director of National Intelligence tomorrow morning. This goes above JSOC now. Above DIA. This is an interagency counterintelligence matter at the senior executive level. I know, Maya said. Which means your role in the investigation changes, Merritt said. You won't be the primary going forward. You'll be the source material. You'll brief the DNI's team. You'll turn over everything you've documented, and then you'll step back while the institutional machinery does what institutional machinery does. Maya understood what that meant. Not a failure, not a diminishment. The handoff was the correct move. What she had uncovered was now large enough that it required resources and authorities she didn't have and wouldn't be given. Handing it to the right people with the full documentation was the responsible completion of the job. When do you need me in Washington? Maya said. Day after tomorrow, Merritt said. I need you to finish the on-site documentation today and tomorrow and have a complete package ready for the DNI briefing. It'll be ready, Maya said. Maya. A pause. What you found the routing identifier in the metadata. Most investigators would have missed it. Most investigators wouldn't have known to look for it. I've seen that architecture before, Maya said. Different case. Similar methodology. Where? A pause. That's classified, Maya said. Merritt made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Of course it is, she said. Day after tomorrow. 0800, my office. The call ended. Maya set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of Vaughn's borrowed office. A deputy director at the Defense Intelligence Agency. She had walked into Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek 3 days ago to investigate a compromised SEAL operation. She was leaving with the beginning of an interagency counterintelligence case that reached into the senior executive structure of the institution responsible for overseeing the people she had just been investigating. The thread, when she pulled it, had gone exactly as far as she had feared it might. She picked up her notebook. She had 2 days to document everything. 2 days to build a package clean enough and complete enough that the DNI's team could pick it up and run without losing a single connection she had made. She opened to a fresh page, and she started at the beginning, not because she had forgotten anything, because the beginning was where the truth was always clearest before the institutional weight of what it implied had settled onto it, before the implications had time to grow complicated, before anyone with something to lose had the opportunity to make the simple thing look murky. The beginning was always the clearest place to start. She wrote the first line, and kept going. She finished the documentation package at 0340 the following morning. 91 pages. Every transfer record, every communication anomaly, every server log, every timeline connection. She had built across 4 days of work at Little Creek, assembled into a package clean enough that a team of DNI investigators could pick it up cold and follow every thread without losing a single step. She printed 2 copies, sealed them in separate classified document envelopes, and wrote her authorization codes on both covers. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not because she was tired, though she was. Because the act of finishing the documentation made the case real in a different way than finding the evidence had. Finding the evidence was instinct and momentum, the forward motion of following a trail that kept revealing itself. Documenting it was something else. It was the moment where everything she had found became something that could be used or contested or buried, depending entirely on what happened in the rooms she was about to walk into. Washington rooms. Rooms where the truth had a price tag, and the people sitting across the table from her would spend the first 20 minutes of every conversation calculating whether they could afford to pay it. She had been in those rooms before. She knew what they cost. She picked up her pen and wrote one final note in the margin of her notebook. 3 words. The kind of shorthand she used for things she needed to carry with her rather than commit to paper. Then she closed the notebook, gathered the 2 document envelopes, and went to find Vaughn. I was already awake. She had expected that. The light was on under his office door when she came down the hallway at 0355, and when she knocked, and he said, "Come in." He was sitting behind his desk with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had also spent the night with things he couldn't put down. "You finished," he said, not a question. 91 pages, Maya said. She set one of the sealed envelopes on his desk. "This copy stays here, locked in your secure storage. If anything happens to my copy before I reach Merritt's office, you open that envelope and you call Admiral Farrington directly. Not through the chain, directly." Vaughn looked at the envelope, then at her. "You think something might happen to your copy? I think the person whose name is in that documentation is sophisticated enough to have considered every contingency," Maya said, "including the possibility that a courier carrying evidence could experience a delay." "A delay," Vaughn said carefully. "Yes," Maya said. "A delay. The kind that gives someone enough time to make a problem disappear before it reaches the right people." The room was quiet for a moment. "I'll keep it in the safe," Vaughn said. "Personal combination. Nobody else has access." "Thank you," Maya said. She turned to go. "Maya," Vaughn said. She stopped. "When this is over, the full investigation, the broader case, is any of it going to be public?" She turned back. "Some of it. Eventually." "Will Weston know how he was found?" "The evidence will be presented in the JAG process," Maya said. "He'll know." "What about the larger case? That depends on decisions made at levels considerably above mine, Maya said. Counterintelligence cases at the senior executive level often don't become public. Sometimes they resolve administratively. Sometimes they disappear entirely into the machinery. And you're comfortable with that? She looked at him. I'm not in the business of comfortable, she said. I'm in the business of finding the truth and putting it in front of the people who have the authority to act on it. What they do with it after that is their weight to carry, not mine. Vaughn nodded slowly. That sounds like you've had to make peace with that before. Several times, she said. He picked up his coffee. Safe travels, he said. She left. The drive to Washington took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Maya drove herself. Not because she was required to, but because she had learned a long time ago that the hours between a completed investigation and the first Washington briefing were the most important thinking time she had. The case was finished, and not finished simultaneously finished, in the sense that the evidence was documented, and sealed, not finished in the sense that the hardest part was ahead. The hardest part was always ahead. It was the part that happened in rooms with people who had more institutional power than she did, and who understood with long experience how to receive inconvenient information in ways that allowed them to contain it. She was not going to let it be contained. She thought about the deputy director. His name was Raymond Colt, 58 years old, 23 years at the Defense Intelligence Agency. A career built on institutional knowledge and the particular kind of intelligence world reputation that accumulates from longevity rather than brilliance. The reputation of someone who had outlasted everyone who had ever questioned him, who had survived every reorganization and every change of administration by making himself essential and making that essentialness difficult to examine too closely. Merritt had given her his file the previous evening, transmitted through a secure channel. Maya had read it twice on the drive and was reading the relevant sections in her memory. Now not from anxiety, but from the specific preparation of someone who understood that you do not walk into a room with Raymond Colt without knowing exactly who Raymond Colt is. He had run assets before. Earlier in his career, when he was a field operations officer rather than an administrator. He knew how asset relationships worked. He knew the architecture of a long-term penetration. He knew where the vulnerabilities were in the monitoring systems, because he had spent years helping design the monitoring systems. That knowledge had made him excellent at his legitimate job for 20 years, and then at some point, that she hadn't yet been able to precisely identify it, had made him something else. The question she was going to need to answer, or help the DNI's team answer, was why. Not for moral clarity, for prosecutorial architecture. Because understanding the motivation behind a 23-year career officer turning an asset against his own institution was the difference between building a case that held and building one that a good defense attorney could unravel at the seams. She pulled into the parking structure at 0743. Merritt was waiting for her at the elevator. John. Sandra Merritt was 61, thin, with silver hair cut short, and eyes that had seen enough in 20 years of intelligence work to have stopped registering surprise as a default response to anything. She had the posture of a person who had spent decades in rooms where posture was read as information, and she moved with the economy of someone who did not waste a single motion on anything that wasn't necessary. She looked at the document envelope in Maya's hand. "Any problems on the drive?" she said. "No," Maya said. "Vaughn has a backup copy in his personal safe at Little Creek, with instructions to call Farrington directly if my copy doesn't arrive." Merritt's expression shifted by approximately 3 millimeters in a direction that indicated approval. "Good thinking." "How are we walking into this?" Maya said as they moved through the security checkpoint. "DNI Director Harrison is in the room," Merritt said. "Along with the DIA director, which is complicated given that the subject is one of his deputy directors. But Harrison insisted, and DIA Director Lawson agreed. There are 2 attorneys from the intelligence community, Inspector General's office, and 1 representative from the National Security Council." Maya processed that. "NSC is there because of the scope. NSC is there because someone made a call last night," Merritt said carefully. "I don't know who. It may mean the case has already moved faster than we planned." Maya looked at her. "Or it means someone is there to observe what we present before deciding how to respond to it." Also possible, Merritt said. They walked in silence for a moment. Does Colt know? Maya said. As of this morning, no, Merritt said. But he's in the building. His office is 4 floors above us. If anyone in that briefing room makes a call before we finish presenting, he could know within the hour. Then we don't give anyone in that room a reason to make a call, Maya said. Merritt looked at her sideways. And how do you propose to manage that? By giving them something they want, more than the ability to manage the situation, Maya said. The truth completely and all at once without the gaps that make partial information easier to contain. When people have the whole picture, the cost of covering it exceeds the cost of acting on it. When they only have pieces, the calculation goes the other way. Merritt was quiet for a moment. You've done this before, she said. Different case, Maya said. Similar room. The briefing room on the 4th floor was the kind of room that had been designed to communicate authority without effort. A long table cleaned surfaces the specific temperature and lighting of a space where consequential decisions were made and were understood by everyone present to be consequential. 5 people were seated when Maya and Merritt entered. D&I Director Harrison sat at the head of the table, a tall, composed man in his mid-60s who had the quality that the best senior intelligence officials share, which is the ability to listen to difficult information without letting the difficulty alter his expression before he had decided what to do with it. DIA Director Lawson sat to Harrison's left. He was younger than Maya had expected, early 50s, a former Army intelligence officer, 2 years in the DIA Director role. He was sitting with the particular stillness of a man who has been told that one of his deputy directors may have compromised a military intelligence asset, and who is managing in real time the difference between his institutional loyalty to the organization he runs and his personal understanding that the information he is about to hear may require him to act against someone inside it. The 2 IG attorneys flanked the middle of the table. One of them had a legal pad and was already writing. The other was watching the door. The NSC representative, a woman named Bennett Forties, with the careful, neutral expression of someone whose job required her to represent institutional interests without revealing what those interests were, sat at the far end of the table. Maya set her document envelope on the table and did not sit down immediately. Director Harrison, she said. Before I open this package, I want to confirm that everyone in this room holds the appropriate clearance to receive the material I'm about to present, and that this briefing is being recorded and logged under the intelligence community's counterintelligence protocols. Harrison looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but close to it, the reaction of a man who had expected a briefer and was recalibrating toward something else. It is, he said. Thank you, Maya said. She broke the seal on the envelope, opened the package, and laid the first document on the table. The case begins at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek 14 days ago, she said, with a compromised SEAL Team 7 operation. It ends in this building. I'm going to show you everything in between. She started talking. She spoke for 47 minutes without interruption. That was unusual. In Maya's experience, Washington briefings were interrupted constantly. Questions, clarifications, institutional objections inserted at the moments when the information became most uncomfortable. The interruptions were rarely about confusion. They were about control, the instinct of powerful people to insert themselves into the flow of information in order to shape how it was received. Nobody interrupted. She had structured the presentation to make interruption counterproductive. Each piece of information built so directly on the previous one that breaking the sequence would leave the interrupter visibly less informed than everyone else in the room. It was a technique she had developed over years of presenting to rooms that didn't want to hear what she had found. When she finished, she set the final document on the table, the routing metadata that traced the second account to the DIA Oversight Division, and said, the account that expedited Gerald Weston's clearance renewal 8 months ago was registered to Deputy Director Raymond Colt. The expedited processing bypassed 2 standard review steps and ensured that Weston remained in position with full operational access for 8 additional months after a routine review would likely have flagged his financial anomalies. The room was completely silent. DIA Director Lawson was looking at the routing metadata document with the expression of a man who is processing something that is simultaneously professionally devastating and personally sickening. Harrison looked at Bennett. Something passed between them, the specific eye contact of people who have worked together long enough to communicate in a glance. Bennett looked at Maya. "How confident are you in the metadata trace?" Bennett said. "The routing identifier is unambiguous," Maya said. "It was decoded against the DIA's internal cipher architecture, which I accessed through an emergency warrant authorized by Admiral Farrington. The account connection to Deputy Director Colt was confirmed through a parallel financial trace conducted by Colonel Merritt. Both traces independently reach the same conclusion. Independent corroboration," Harrison said. "Not a question." He was confirming for the record that the evidence had not arrived through a single chain. "Yes, sir," Maya said. "Every conclusion in this package has at least 2 independent evidentiary sources. I structured it that way specifically to address the durability requirements of a senior executive-level counterintelligence case." Harrison looked at the document package, then at Lawson. "Marcus," he said. Lawson looked up from the routing metadata. His face had the quality of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time without knowing what it was and has just been shown the shape of it. "I know," Lawson said, quietly. "I know what needs to happen." "Are you comfortable making the call from this room?" "No," Lawson said, "but I'm going to make it anyway." He picked up the secure phone on the table, dialed an internal number, and said when the line connected, "This is Director Lawson. I need Raymond Colt's access credentials suspended immediately. All systems, all clearance levels effective this moment." "Yes, this moment." A pause. "Because I'm ordering it. Do it." He set the phone down. The room was quiet. Maya looked at the table and thought about Gerald Weston sitting in a conference room at Little Creek waiting for his lawyer. She thought about the 47 words that had put 3 men in medical care. She thought about the 14 months of small money movements and careful architecture and the specific intelligence that goes into building something designed to never be seen. She thought about Raymond Colt, 4 floors above her in the same building, whose access credentials had just been suspended while he sat at his desk doing whatever people do in the moments before everything changes. "Miss Collins," Harrison said. She looked up. "How long have you been doing this work?" She looked at him steadily. "Long enough," she said. Harrison almost smiled. "Colonel Merritt gave me the same answer when I asked her this morning." "It's the accurate answer," Maya said. "I'd like to read your full personnel file," he said. "Most of it is classified above my own access level," Maya said. "I'm aware," Harrison said. "I have the access." He said it without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact, the way people state facts in rooms like this. "You're welcome to read it," Maya said. "It won't explain this investigation. This investigation is 4 days of evidence building on top of 12 years of learning what to look for." "And where did you learn what to look for?" Harrison said. "In places that are in the parts of the file you're going to want to read twice," Maya said. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Something settled in his expression, a kind of assessment that she recognized from experience as the moment a person of significant institutional authority decides that someone in front of them is going to be an asset worth keeping. She noted it, filed it, did not let it mean anything yet. Chatang. The debrief lasted another 2 hours. The IG attorneys asked 40 questions. Maya answered every one of them with the same precision she had used to present the original package. No elaboration beyond what the evidence supported. No speculation flagged without being clearly labeled as speculation. No gap in the documentation left unacknowledged. By the time the final question was answered, the 2 attorneys had filled 4 legal pads between them. Lawson left the room twice to take calls. Each time he came back, something in his expression had tightened by a degree. The accumulating weight of what was happening to an institution he had spent 2 years trying to stabilize landing on him in real time. Maya watched him without making it visible that she was watching. Because Lawson mattered. Not to this specific case. Weston was going to jag. Regardless of what Lawson felt about it, and Colt's fate was now in the hands of people considerably above both of them. Lawson mattered to what came after. The DIA's response to this, how its director framed it internally, how he rebuilt the oversight structures that had allowed Colt to operate, how he talked about it to the people who worked under him. That response would determine whether the institution learned from it or managed it. The difference between those two outcomes was not small. When the debrief ended and people began gathering their things, Maya found a moment to move to Lawson's side of the table. "Director Lawson," she said quietly. He looked at her. Up close, the weight was more visible, the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent the last 3 hours absorbing something that changes the shape of everything he is responsible for. "I want to say something that isn't in the documentation," Maya said. "Go ahead," he said. "The DIA's oversight structure didn't fail because it was poorly designed," Maya said. "It failed because someone with 23 years of institutional knowledge used that knowledge to find the specific gap between what the structure was designed to catch and what it actually monitored in practice. That gap is not unique to the DIA. It exists in every oversight structure built by people who also operate within it." "You're telling me this isn't a DIA problem," Lawson said. "I'm telling you it is a DIA problem," Maya said. "And a JSOC problem. And a broader community problem. What happened here is a specific instance of a general vulnerability. The way you respond to this instance will either narrow the general vulnerability or leave it open for the next Raymond Colt." Lawson looked at her for a long moment. "What would you do?" he said. "If you were sitting where I'm sitting, I'd start with the personnel audit function," Maya said. "Specifically the clearance expediting protocol. The mechanism Colt used to protect Weston was legitimate. The expediting protocol exists for valid operational reasons. But it requires a single authorization and generates minimal documentation. That's the gap. Close it by requiring dual authorization and a full documentation trail for every expedited clearance action at the senior level." Lawson was quiet. "That'll create friction in the system," he said. "Yes," Maya said. "That's the point. The friction is the protection." He looked at her with the expression she had seen on Vaughn's face 3 days ago. The look of a person who has encountered someone who says the true thing without managing it, and who is deciding in real time whether that quality is welcome or threatening. "Thank you," Lawson said. And he meant it. She could hear it. She nodded and stepped back. Merritt found her in the hallway outside the briefing room. "Harrison wants to see you," Merritt said. "Privately. His office. 15 minutes." Maya looked at her. "Do you know what about?" she said. "I have a guess," Merritt said. "But I'd rather let him tell you himself." Maya nodded. 15 minutes. She used them to stand in the hallway alone, which was something she had learned to do, to take the spaces between consequential things and use them to recalibrate rather than to accelerate. To let the weight of what had happened settle before the weight of what was coming landed. She thought about Little Creek. About 12 operators who had measured her in a glance and concluded she was nothing. About the specific quality of that dismissal, not hostile exactly, but so complete that it hadn't even required effort. It had been the natural consequence of a closed system that had stopped questioning its own assumptions about what capability looked like. She thought about Vaughn saying, "Yes, ma'am." She thought about Casillas coming through the door at 1830 and asking the right question. She thought about the 3 operators still in medical care from March 4th, who would eventually learn that the mission failure that had put them there had been traced, documented, and handed to people with the authority to ensure it didn't happen again. They would probably never know her name. That was fine. She had learned a long time ago that the work was not about her name. The 15 minutes ended. She went to find Harrison. His office was the kind of office that communicated the weight of its occupant's position without trying to not through decoration or display, but through the specific quality of quiet that rooms accumulate when consequential decisions have been made in them for a long time. Harrison was standing when she came in. Not as a formality, he was standing at his window with his back to the door, and when he heard her enter, he turned and gestured to the 2 chairs at the small table to the side of his desk, rather than the desk itself. The chairs were the gesture of a person who was choosing to have a different kind of conversation than the one they had just finished downstairs. "Sit down," he said. They both sat. "I've been in this position for 4 years," Harrison said. "In those 4 years, I have received 41 briefings that involved evidence of internal compromise at the senior level. Of those 41, 19 reached evidentiary conclusions that held under subsequent review." He paused. "Yours is the most complete package I have ever received from a field investigator at your level." Maya said nothing. "Colonel Merritt tells me you built the entire evidentiary architecture in 4 days," Harrison said. "On a base where you had no existing relationships, working with a command structure that was actively hostile to your presence." "The hostility was useful," Maya said. "It gave me a clean observation environment." Harrison almost smiled. "That's one way to describe it." He leaned forward slightly. "I want to discuss your future with the intelligence community." "I'm listening," Maya said. "The case you've just handed us is going to generate a significant counterintelligence review across multiple agencies," Harrison said. "That review is going to require people who understand how penetrations are built from the inside, how they're maintained, and most critically, how to find them after they've been running long enough to become invisible. Those people are rare. The specific combination of field experience, analytical precision, and the ability to operate without institutional support in a hostile environment is not something you can manufacture through training programs." "No," Maya agreed. "You can't." "I want to offer you a position," Harrison said. "Senior Investigative Advisor to the DNI's Counterintelligence Review Team. Full authority cross-agency access reporting directly to me." Maya looked at him. The offer was significant. In the specific language of the intelligence community, Senior Investigative Advisor to the DNI, with cross-agency access, was not a title. It was a structural position, one that would give her the institutional reach to pursue the kind of case she had just built. Not as a one-time field deployment, but as a standing function. It would also mean Washington. Permanently. Rooms like the one downstairs consistently. The machinery of institutional decision-making, with all its friction and its contingencies and its people who calculated the cost of truth before deciding whether to pay it. She had spent 12 years deliberately staying outside that machinery, moving through it when necessary, but returning always to the field, to the position of someone who could observe without being observed, who could assess without being assessed. The offer on the table would change that. She looked at Harrison. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. "How long do I have?" "A week," he said. "The review team convenes in 10 days. She nodded. "You'll have my answer in a week." Harrison nodded. He reached across the table and offered his hand. Maya shook it. "Miss Collins," he said. "What Colt was running the Weston operation, the clearance manipulation, it didn't start with Weston. You know that." "I know," she said. "The evidentiary trail you've documented gets us to Colt. It doesn't tell us how far back it goes or how wide it runs." "No," Maya said. "It doesn't. The review team is going to need to find that," Harrison said. "The beginning of it. The point where Raymond Colt decided to become something other than what his institution believed he was. And whatever is at that beginning is likely to be considerably more uncomfortable than what you found at Little Creek." "Probably," Maya said. "Does that concern you?" She looked at him. "No," she said. Harrison held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, and she understood the meeting was finished. She stood, picked up her notebook, and walked to the door. "One more thing," Harrison said. She stopped. "Commander Vaughn submitted a formal commendation to Admiral Farrington's office this morning," he said. "On your behalf. He described you as the most effective investigator he had ever worked with." Maya stood with her hand on the door. "He included a personal note," Harrison said. "It said, and I'm quoting directly, that the most important thing the investigation had taught his unit was not how to prevent the next Weston. It was how to stop assuming they already knew the answer before they had looked at the question." Maya was quiet for a moment. "That's the lesson," she said. "Yes," Harrison said. "I thought so too." She opened the door and walked out into the hallway. The document package was already in the IG attorney's custody. The evidence chain was intact. Colt's credentials were suspended. The machinery was moving, and it was moving because she had handed it something true and complete and built to last. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood in the quiet of the hallway and thought about Vaughn's note, about what it had cost him to write it, not the words, but the honesty underneath them. The willingness to say in a formal document that he had been wrong about the most fundamental thing, not the investigation, not the methodology, not even the conclusions, but the assumption he had made before any of that. The assumption about who she was before she had the chance to show him. She had spent 12 years working in the space that assumption created. She was still deciding whether to come in from it. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors closed, and she rode down alone in the quiet with her notebook in her hand, and her answer not yet fully formed, but closer, considerably closer than it had been when the day began. She gave herself 6 days, not the full week. Harrison had offered 6 days, because on the 7th she would know, and waiting past the point of knowing was a habit she had broken a long time ago in a different country, under circumstances that had taught her with considerable force that hesitation past certainty was not caution. It was avoidance dressed in careful language. She spent the first 2 days in her apartment in Alexandria, doing nothing that looked like deciding. She ran in the mornings. She read in the evenings. She cooked meals she didn't particularly taste, and sat at her kitchen table with her notebook closed in front of her, and thought about everything except the question, which was the way she had always worked through the questions that mattered, by giving them room to surface on their own, rather than forcing them into the light before they were ready. On the 3rd day, Merritt called. "How are you thinking?" Merritt said. "Carefully," Maya said. "Harrison asked me this morning if I had a read on your answer." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know," Merritt said. "Which is true. But I also told him that if you said no, it would be the most significant loss of operational investigative capacity this office has experienced in a decade." A pause. "I want you to know I meant that. Not as pressure, as information." "I know the difference," Maya said. "I know you do," Merritt said. "That's why I said it." The call ended. Maya sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she set it down and looked at the ceiling and thought about the elevator. About the ride down from Harrison's office alone in the quiet, her notebook in her hand, and her answer not yet formed, but closer. It was closer now. She thought about what the position meant in practice. Cross-agency access. Reporting to Harrison. The institutional reach to pursue not just individual cases, but the systemic vulnerabilities that individual cases revealed, the structural gaps, the oversight failures, the places where trust had calcified into assumption, and assumption had become the thing that people with bad intentions used as cover. She thought about Raymond Colt. Not with anger. Anger was not a useful instrument in this work, and she had learned to set it aside cleanly, but with the specific analytical attention she brought to every subject. Colt was in custody. His credentials were suspended. The JAG process for Weston was running. The IG attorneys were building a case file that would take months to complete and would ultimately reach conclusions that either became public or disappeared into the machinery, and that outcome was above her pay grade and always had been. What was not above her pay grade was what came next. Harrison had said it clearly, the evidentiary trail she had documented got them to Colt. It didn't tell them how far back it went or how wide it ran. She thought about that. About the beginning of it. About the point where a man with 23 years of institutional service had made a decision, not spontaneously, not in a moment of crisis, but deliberately, carefully, with full understanding of what he was doing and what it would cost the people whose safety depended on the integrity of the institution he was selling. That point existed. There was a moment, a conversation, a circumstance that had opened a door in Raymond Colt's mind and led him from where he had been to where he ended up. And at that moment, there had almost certainly been another person. Someone who had identified him as a potential asset, had assessed his vulnerabilities, had made the first careful approach. That person was still out there. That was the thing she had not said in Harrison's office, because she had not yet had enough to say it with. But she had been thinking about it since the second night at Little Creek, when she had found the second account's routing identifier and understood that the case was larger than Weston. The person who had recruited Colt was not Colt's peer. You don't recruit a deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency using peer-level tradecraft. You recruit a deputy director using someone with access patience and the specific understanding of what a 23-year career officer looks like from the outside versus what it feels like from the inside. Someone who knew institutions, who knew how they worked and how they failed, and where the people inside them were most vulnerable. Someone, in other words, who operated the way she operated. That thought had been sitting at the back of her mind since the third day at Little Creek, quiet and persistent, and she had not let herself look at it directly until now, because looking at it directly changed everything. It changed what the case was, and it changed what saying yes to Harrison would actually mean. On the fourth day, she drove back to Little Creek. Not because she had been asked to, because she needed to do one more thing before she could answer Harrison's question, and that thing was not in Washington. Vaughn was surprised to see her. I was standing in the hallway outside his office when she came through the security checkpoint. And he stopped walking when he recognized her. A brief, visible pause that was as close to thrown off balance as she had ever seen him. "You came back," he said. "I said I'd consider it," she said. "I considered it." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the particular quality of a man who had correctly predicted something and was more relieved than satisfied about being right. "Cassilis is going to want to know you're here," he said. "I'll find him," she said. "I need to talk to you first." They went to his office. She sat across from him and said without preamble, "I've been offered a position, Senior Investigative Advisor to the DNI, cross-agency access reporting directly to Harrison." Vaughn looked at her. "That's significant." "Yes." "Are you going to take it?" "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I came back here because there's something I need to ask you, and your answer is going to affect mine." He leaned back slightly. "Ask." "The 3 operators who were hurt on March 4th, she said. "I need to know how they're doing. Not medically, I have the medical reports. I mean how they're actually doing, how they're processing what happened to them." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "Peterson is angry," he said. "He's in physical therapy, and the anger is helping him push harder, which is useful now and will probably need to be managed later. Kowalski is quiet. He's the type who goes internal, and his team leader is watching him carefully. Torres is—" He stopped. "Torres," Maya said. "Torres found out 2 days ago that the March 4th failure was not a technical issue," Vaughn said. "Cassilis told the team in a general briefing. Torres is the youngest operator, 26. He's been in the teams for 3 years. He had a conversation with Cassilis afterward that I heard about secondhand." He paused. He asked if the people responsible would actually be held accountable, or if it would get managed. Maya was quiet. "What did Cassilis tell him?" "He told him that someone had already made sure it would be held accountable," Vaughn said. "He used your name." Maya sat with that. "Torres asked who you were," Vaughn continued. "Not your title, who you were. Cassilis told him you were the person who walked in here with a notebook and a folder and found in 4 days what this unit had missed for 14 months. "What did Torres say?" Vaughn looked at her directly. "He said he wanted to shake your hand." The room was quiet. Maya looked at the wall where her timeline had been. She had taken it down before she left, but the faint marks where the tape had held were still visible, and she found herself looking at those marks, the way you look at the place where something important used to be. "That's why you came back," Vaughn said. "It was not a question. I came back because before I decide whether to step into a position that puts me permanently inside the machinery." Maya said, "I needed to remember what the machinery is for." Vaughn said nothing. "It's for Torres," she said. "It's for the 26-year-old who goes into the field trusting the intelligence picture he's given and deserves to have that picture be accurate. It's for every operator who relies on institutions to be honest with them about the ground they're walking on." She paused. "When I'm in Washington in rooms with people calculating the cost of truth, it's easy to lose the thread back to that. I needed to come here first to make sure I still had it." Vaughn was very still. "Do you?" he said. "Yes. she said. He nodded once. Then take the position, he said. Because the thing you just described, the thread back to what the machinery is for, that's the thing those rooms are going to need most. And it's the thing most people in those rooms lost somewhere along the way without noticing. Maya looked at him. You've changed, she said. You changed me, Vaughn said. Not sentimentally. As a statement of accurate causation. No, Maya said. I showed you something that was already true. You changed yourself. He almost smiled. The muscles around his eyes moved in the direction of it. Is that the distinction that matters? He said. It's the only distinction that matters, she said. People who are changed by someone else's demonstration go back to what they were when the demonstration ends. People who change themselves don't. She found Cassilis at the firing range. He saw her coming and lowered his weapon and waited the posture of a man who had been expecting this and had been preparing himself for it, though he would not have said so out loud. You came back, he said. Briefly, she said. He studied her face with the assessment of someone who has learned to read what people aren't saying. You're deciding something. I decided, she said. I came to tell you in person. Tell me what? That the case is going further, she said. Above Colt. There's a person behind Colt, someone who recruited him, who understood this institution well enough to identify him as a viable asset and approach him in a way he didn't resist. Finding that person is going to take longer and require access I didn't have before. And now you'll have it, Cassilis said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is it going to be dangerous? Probably, she said honestly. More dangerous than Little Creek. Little Creek was safe, she said. The danger there was contained. What comes next is less contained. Cassilis looked at her with the direct measuring quality that 12 years in special operations had built into him, the ability to look at someone and accurately assess whether they understood what they were walking toward. You understand what you're walking toward, he said. Yes, she said. And you're walking toward it anyway. Yes. He nodded slowly. Something moved through his expression, not admiration exactly, but the particular respect that professionals extend to other professionals when they recognize a specific kind of courage. Not the loud kind. The quiet, deliberate kind that chooses difficulty with full knowledge of the cost. The team wanted me to give you something, he said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper and held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it. Inside, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were 12 signatures. Every operator from Team 7. Below the signatures in Cassilis's handwriting, 4 words. We see you now. Maya looked at the paper for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her notebook. She didn't trust herself to say anything immediately, so she said the thing that was most true and most simple. Tell them thank you, she said. Tell them yourself, Cassilis said. They're in the briefing room. Vaughn told them you were here. She looked at him. They asked if they could see you before you left, he said. All 12 of them. Not for a briefing, just to see you. She walked into the briefing room and stood at the front of it, the way she had stood there on the first morning, same position, same posture, no weapon, no uniform, no rank. The difference was everything else. 12 operators, and Vaughn stood when she came in. Not at attention, not formally, not performatively. They simply stood the way people stand when someone enters a room who has earned that from them without asking for it. She looked at them. They looked back. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Torres, she recognized him from the personnel files, 26 years old, the youngest face in the room, stepped forward from the second row and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm. His eyes were direct. And in them she saw the thing Cassilis had described, the question of whether accountability was real, and the answer he had been given, and what that answer had done to the way he understood the institution he served. Thank you, Torres said, quietly, without theater. You're welcome, she said. He stepped back. She looked at the room. I'm going to say something to all of you, she said. And then I'm leaving, and I won't be coming back here in an official capacity. What I'm going to say is not in any report I've written, and it won't be in any report I write going forward. The room was completely quiet. What happened to this unit was not your failure, she said. I want to be clear about that. The penetration that Gerald Weston carried out and the infrastructure that protected it was built by people with considerable resources and considerable patience, specifically designed to exploit the trust that makes a unit like this one function. You were not naive. You were targeted. The targeting was sophisticated, and the execution was patient, and the protection from above was institutional. None of that is on you. Nobody moved. What is on you, she said, is what comes next. How you operate going forward. Whether you take what happened here and use it to build something harder to break, or whether you carry it as a weight that makes you smaller. I've watched this unit for 6 days, and I know which one you're going to do. But I wanted to say it out loud before I left, so that you have something to come back to on the days when it's harder than you expected. She looked at the room one more time. You're good at what you do, she said. Be harder to fool, that's all. She picked up her notebook. She walked to the door. Behind her, nobody spoke. But as she reached the doorway, she heard one by one, staggered, not coordinated, but arriving at the same place through separate decisions. 12 people say the same 2 words. Thank you, ma'am. 12 voices. Cassilis's was the last. She walked out into the hallway without turning around. She called Harrison from the parking lot. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting. I'll take the position, she said. A brief pause. Good, Harrison said. Simply. Without elaboration, which was the right response, and told her something useful about the kind of director he was. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. I report to you, and only to you, she said. No committee review of active investigations. No institutional sign-off requirements on access requests during time-sensitive windows. And I retain the operational authority to work without announcing my methodology in advance. The last one is going to create friction, Harrison said. The friction is the protection, Maya said. Someone taught me that recently. A pause on Harrison's end. She could hear him processing the echo of his own institutional logic return to him from an unexpected direction. Agreed, he said. All 3. Then I'll be in your office Monday morning, she said. We'll be ready, he said. The call ended. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. The base was quiet around her, the specific quality of quiet that military installations carry in the middle of the day. A focused silence that is not the absence of activity, but the presence of purpose. She thought about Raymond Colt, sitting in a room somewhere suspended, waiting for the machinery to reach him. She thought about Weston doing the same thing at Little Creek. She thought about the person behind Colt, still unidentified, still operating, still believing that the investigation had stopped at the level it was supposed to stop at, that the architecture was too sophisticated to trace further, that the distance between what had been found and what still existed was wide enough to be safe. That distance was not as wide as they believed. She had started closing it the moment she found the routing identifier in the metadata. She would keep closing it from a desk 4 floors below the Director of National Intelligence, with cross-agency access and a direct reporting line, and the specific institutional authority to go where the evidence went, regardless of whose name appeared at the end of the trail. She opened her car door. She thought about the paper in her notebook. 12 signatures, 4 words. We see you now. She had spent 12 years in the space that invisibility created. Moving through institutions without being seen, using the assumption of powerlessness as a tool, letting the dismissal of others become the clarity from which she worked. It had been effective. It had produced results that no other methodology could have produced in the same time, under the same conditions, with the same constraints. But there was a cost to invisibility that she had not fully calculated until Little Creek. Not the professional cost, the personal one. The way that operating without being seen eventually begins to feel like the only way to operate. The way the invisibility over time stops being a choice and starts being a habit. And habits unchecked become walls. Vaughn had seen her. Eventually. Correctly. Cassilis had seen her. Torres had extended his hand and looked her in the eyes and said thank you, with the directness of a person acknowledging that the person in front of them is real and visible and worth the acknowledgement. She had folded that paper and put it in her notebook, because it was the first external confirmation she had held in years that being seen was not a vulnerability. It was a beginning. She got in the car. She thought about Monday morning, about Harrison's office and the review team and the case file that started with 47 words and a failed SEAL operation and reached into the senior executive structure of the Defense Intelligence Agency and kept going further than anyone had yet mapped. About the person behind Colt, who was still out there, still operating, still unaware that the investigator who had built the case that found Colt was now sitting 4 floors below the director, with the authority and the access to find them too. She started the car. She thought about Torres asking Casillas whether the people responsible would actually be held accountable. She thought about what accountable meant not as a legal category, not as a formal outcome, but as the lived experience of a 26-year-old operator who had gone into the field trusting the picture he was given and deserved to know that when that picture was corrupted, someone cared enough to follow it to the source and refused to stop. She pulled out of this parking lot. She drove toward Washington. She did not look back, not from hardness, not from indifference, but from the specific clarity of a person who knows exactly where they have been and exactly where they are going, and understands with the earned certainty of 12 years of doing difficult work in invisible places that the direction forward is the only direction that matters. The case was not finished. It would not be finished for months, possibly longer. The threads she had found would lead to other threads, and those would lead to others, and at the end of all of them would be a truth that was considerably more uncomfortable than anything she had documented so far. She knew that. She had always known it from the moment she found the routing identifier and understood that Weston was the bottom of the chain and the chain went considerably higher. She was ready. Not because she was fearless. She had long ago stopped confusing readiness with the absence of fear. She was ready because she had done this long enough to know the difference between the fear that protects you and the fear that stops you. And she had learned case by case, year by year, room by difficult room, to move through the second kind without letting it determine the direction. The people who had burned March 4th had believed with the particular arrogance of those who have operated inside trusted institutions for long enough to believe they are untouchable that the case would stop at Weston. They had not accounted for Maya Collins. They had not accounted for the woman who walked into a room full of the most elite operators in the United States military, with a worn notebook and a manila folder, and was dismissed in a glance, and used that dismissal as a starting position. They had not accounted for what happens when you mistake silence for weakness, patience for passivity, and invisibility for the absence of capability. They were about to find out. And when they did, when the threads finally led to wherever they led, when the documentation was complete, and the evidence was in front of the right people, and the accountability that Torres had asked about became visible and real and undeniable, it would not be because the machinery had finally worked the way it was supposed to. It would be because one woman had refused to stop. That was always how the truth survived. Not through institutions, though institutions mattered. Not through authority, though authority had its place. Through the specific, unglamorous, relentless work of one person, following one thread at a time, past every room that told her to stop. Past every assumption that said she didn't belong. Past every dismissal that tried to make the truth smaller than it was. Maya Collins had never been defenseless. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the people who needed to understand that were ready to see it. Now they saw it. And the work, the real work, the work that would define the next chapter of everything she had spent 12 years building toward, was just beginning.